This is Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan Proft and Amy Jacobson on AM 560. The Answer.
Good morning, Dan and Amy. Our friend Selena Zito writes for the Washington Examiner. He's here on CNN. She was, sort of the outlier in the D.C. press corps when it came to covering the 2016 election, seeing something happening out in the hustings that the Beltway crowd did not. She's got a new book out that she co-authored about the Trump election, The Great Revolt Inside the Populist Coalition Reshaping American Politics. And our friend Peter Berkowitz from the Hoover Institution distills this nicely in a piece that he wrote for Real Clear Politics, where he talks about the 7 archetypes of Trump voters that are outlined in Zito's book. Which category are you? Red-blooded and blue-collared. These are, working-class whites who lost a job, watched family members lose theirs, but remained optimistic about their fortunes and their country. Red-blooded and blue-collared. Perroistas, from the Ross Perot era, sort of the infrequent voter who likes the maverick on both sides of the spectrum. Rough rebounders, experienced a setback in life and saw the same kind of vulnerability and recovery in Trump as they had experienced. Girl gunpowder, strong, smart, independent women who like their guns because they provide the ability to defend themselves. Rotary reliables, white-collar job holders in blue-collar communities. And this is my favorite. King Cyrus Christians.
King Cyrus.
Yeah, they from the 6th century monarch who released the Jews from Babylonian captivity. Religious conservatives who, despite Trump's dubious history on these topics, threw their lot in with him because they believed in his promises for judges and so forth. It's what Tony Perkins said. It was never about shared values. It was about common interests, and describing his support for Trump. And finally, silent suburban moms. They tended to be less religious and less pro-life, often reluctant to admit their preference for Trump. These women put a premium on economic issues. They disliked his lewdness, but were convinced that Trump would do more for their communities than would Hillary. 7 coalition groups in this populist conservative Trump coalition. Can it hold through the midterms and beyond? That's a question we explore with the aforesaid Peter Berkowitz. He's a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution and regular columnist in the Wall Street Journal and other outlets. Peter, thanks for joining us again. Appreciate it.
Good to be with you. Thanks.
So you like this kind of distillation of the Trump coalition that Selena Zito put together. What's your assessment on the prospects of it holding Republicans in control of Congress?
First I'd like to say that Selena Zito gets a lot of credit here. As she herself points out, where the other reporters were jamming themselves on chartered buses, planes to cover the candidates, she covered the voters. That was hugely important. And the knowledge that she's provided us about the voters will help us answer this question: can this Trump populist conservative coalition hold together? The short answer is it's going to be very difficult.
Well,
why
right.
The obvious question: why is it going to be difficult?
Right, because the populist elements and the conservative elements pull in different directions, and Trump is not so far, not likely to be an eloquent tribune on behalf of conservative principles. If we look back over the last half century and more to examine modern American conservatism, we see 2 principles driving it. One is preserve traditional morality. The other is defend limited government. And you can see various interactions of these principles, but this has defined the conservative movement, these 2 principles. Trump was a champion of neither, certainly not explicitly. In fact, president, he's deregulated, cut taxes, he has appointed judges in the mold of Scalia, so he's advanced conservative purposes. That's true. On the other hand, these voters that Selena Zito interviewed in their homes, in their diners, in their workplaces. These are men and women, some of whom were conservative, but many of them had voted for Obama. What they were concerned about were their ailing communities from which industries had left. And they were moved by somehow Donald Trump, the billionaire from New York City, channeled their distress, spoke to their concerns, championed their country. The question for conservatives going forward, for this coalition going forward, is, are limited government policies, limited government principles consistent with the policies that will respond to the economic plight of the people in these rural communities that voted for Trump?
Well, so here's the thing, and you're right to point this out. Goldman Sachs yesterday provided a negative outlook, fiscal outlook for the U.S., largely because of the projected ballooning federal deficits that accompany Trump administration and Republican congressional spending, and that's the point. Republican congressional spending. And this goes back to George W. Bush, right? An establishment conservative, a compassionate conservative. And what did we see under George W. Bush with the establishment conservatives in charge? A new Medicare entitlement and not as much spending as we ultimately endured under Obama, but it was hardly anything that resembles what conservatives would normally consider fiscal conservatism. So in point of fact, with conservatives, some of the conservatives, particularly the intellectual set, that is reticent to embrace Trump. The reality on the ground is what Rand Paul said in excoriating Republicans voting for the $1.3 trillion omnibus spending bill, which is when when Democrats are in charge, we're conservatives. When we're in charge, we're Democrats.
Yes, so this is a huge problem. But here's the thing: that's a long-term problem. I think all the responsible economists agree. The trajectories, the economic trajectories, the budget trajectories we're on are simply unsustainable. Responsible adults, responsible conservatives understand reforms have to be made in the entitlement state. Can those reforms in the entitlement state be made consistent with crafting policies that respond to the short-term needs of these swing voters and conservative voters in the 5 Democratic blue wall states, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, Iowa? That's the huge challenge for this new fusion of populism and conservatism going forward.
Do you think, though, that Trump is threading the needle pretty well right now with those coalition groups as described in Zito's book, where you see sort of the deal-making with China that ultimately may result in what Larry Kudlow said, barriers lowered on both sides and more growth opportunities for America. Examples, you mentioned the massive deregulation on a scale not even contemplated by Reagan, frankly, at least in the modern context, the tax cuts, the effort on Obamacare that stalled in Congress, but you could argue it wasn't necessarily, or at least the primacy of responsibility doesn't reside at Trump's doorstep. Has he been able to do enough to feed the hopes and desires of these disparate coalition partners?
You know, all we can say at this point is that for the reasons you just enumerated, actually Trump is in the right direction. We also can say that unemployment is at or near record lows, including for blacks and Latinos. The question of employment is something you don't have to read in newspapers about. You don't need to have interpreted for you by highbrow magazines like Foreign Affairs. You know whether you're employed or not. So my guess is yes, this will have an impact on voters. How much of an impact? Hard to say. We're going to have to wait and see.
You wrote in your article about the silent suburban moms. Can you explain that and what they are and what impact they have on Trump?
Yes, this was a target constituency for Hillary Clinton. She ran hard for these voters. Trump did not do amazingly well among the silent suburban moms. The women whom you might expect would be outraged by his various crude remarks. But nevertheless, Trump did less bad than many people suspected he would. Mm-hmm. And the reason for that, according to Zito's interviews, was straightforward. These women put the welfare of their communities afflicted by the opioid crisis, afflicted by the flight of industry, afflicted in their judgment by illegal immigration. They put these issues ahead of their concerns about his public decorum. And he did better among them than expected.
Yeah, and I got to tell you, he's doing, I agree with you in terms of being cautious about the ability to continue to keep this quilt stitched together, but
yes.
He's done much better than I anticipated in terms of dealing with. I'm not as sophisticated as Selena Zito. I just boiled it down into two groups: those who've been hurt
yes.
economically and those who were ridiculed culturally. And I think he's done a pretty good job of serving both of those large and diverse constituencies, combined with the fact that the assault that he takes, unfair in many instances, from the D.C. press corps on a daily basis, and in the context of this Russian collusion investigation, I think just repels more people from the Beltway establishment they rejected in 2016 and towards Trump if it's going to be this binary.
Well, you make a good point, and I should emphasize the point that Zito emphasizes, is that a common complaint tying together all 7 of her categories is the sense among Trump voters that the establishment, not only the Democratic establishment, but also the Republican establishment, despises them. In other words, there was a powerful cultural element to the vote for Trump.
Yeah. Right. Peter Berkowitz, columnist, author, and senior fellow at the Hoover Institution. His recent piece in RealClearPolitics.com, Can Trump's Populist Conservative Coalition Hold? It's definitely worth a read and some consideration. Peter, thanks as always for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer